Hello, everyone. Hello, Vue Nation. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about Vue's built-in components. My name is Paige Kelley. I am a senior software developer at Pax8. We're out here in Denver, Colorado, and I've been using the Vue framework for about 4 years now. I've really loved not only the framework itself, but also the community that it's been built around. That's why it's so exciting for me to be here today, talking to all of you, developers from all over the world who are just as excited about Vue as I am. There's been a lot of really cool topics covered over the last couple of days. I was inspired to do my talk on Vue's built-in components after a fellow developer suggested KeepAlive and Teleport as solutions to some of the problems I was running into on a project. So I knew these components existed, but since I had never really dug too deep into them, they weren't the first things I thought of as solutions to the problems I was running into. But using them really helped my developer experience and made my code base a lot stronger. So I'm hoping after today's presentation, you have a few new tools in your belt. And if you run into some of the problems that I was running into, you think of these built-in components as solutions first. Don't worry, when we get to the problems or the components that fix these problems, I will point them out to you. Brings us to our next slide. So Vue 3 comes with a set of 5 different built-in components that we're going to be talking about today. They are Teleport, KeepAlive, Transition, Transition Group, and Suspense. Although Suspense is still just an experimental feature, so we're not going to be diving as deep into that one today. And in the spirit of the meme competition that's been happening throughout Vue Nation, I made my own little meme with the cat doing tree shaking, because if you're not using these built-in components already, do not worry, they're not making your application any bigger because they are all tree shakeable. Which brings us to our first component, which is Teleport. Teleport was originally called Portal, and it was available to us even before it was a built-in component through things like plugins like Portal Vue. This is the first one of the components that I used. It helped me solve a problem in my project. I'm working on a component library, and in that component library, I've had to build components like modals, dialogues, notifications. If you've ever had to build a component that needs to pop up over all of the other elements in your UI, you'll know that their position in the DOM is super important. That's where Teleport comes in. Teleport lets us target an area of the DOM where we want our component to appear. It could even appear outside of the scope of our application, which is pretty useful. All right, so picking up where we left off, Teleport, originally called Portal Vue, it's helping us target areas of the DOM where we want our components to appear. And now we're going to look at a code example that I have of a modal using Teleport to help it. Okay, good. Video is up. All right, so here in our code example, we have a basic white modal, which is just a card with a slot inside of it, on top of an opaque background that emits an event when it's clicked on. We're also passing in this prop called modal open, which is a Boolean, passing that if. So now we're going to go into our Teleport demo. We're going to call this component, pass in that prop, and listen for that click event. We also have some text we're passing into the slot and a button that is going to toggle if it's open or not. Open modal, everything's working as expected here, but we don't have a lot on this page to interfere with our modal. So let's go back into the code and add another element onto our page that might mess with our modal appearing above everything. I've already created this class called Destroy that has a few basic stylings on it: red background, white text, absolute position. So let's add a div class up at the top called Destroy, and we'll clean that up, add some text in here. So this div class is going to destroy our modal. We'll go back in. Now you can see it here at the top. Our modal's still working as expected, which is great, but let's see what happens when we move that destroy element around in our code. So we're going to copy that, paste it underneath our modal. Now let's open our modal back up, and you can see the destroy elements on top of the background, and we don't want that. This is just a really, really basic example of how position in the DOM can affect things like modals or other pop-ups. We could come up with a really quick solution by like just slapping a z-index that's really high on this background in modal, but that's still a flimsy solution since things like stacking context and other elements with competing z-indexes could still break this modal. So let's go back in and use teleport as a solution to making sure our modal stays on top of all of the other elements. So let's go in and we're going to go into our modal component and we're going to wrap all of the content in here with teleport. Teleport takes in a prop called to, and that's where we're going to tell teleport where to send our elements inside of it to. So we're going to make an ID called teleport here. Close that up, grab our closing tag, add that down on the bottom, save it, and now we are going to copy this, go into our index.html, and outside the scope of our application, right above our closing body tag, we're going to add the div with the ID of teleport here. Now let's go back into the browser and see how that's all working. Pull this down so we could see the layout. Now we have our div with the ID of teleport here, nothing's in it. We open up our modal and it's been teleported in there on top of that destroy element. So it's all working as expected. It's great. We could also teleport things to places that aren't IDs, like the body tag. So let's send our modal over to the body tag to see that working too, just to see how we could teleport to different places. Now let's open up their modal tag. It's outside of teleport here, but right above the closing body tag. This is great. Now it's going to stay on top of all of our other elements in the page. So that was a really brief demo of how teleport could work, which brings us over to our next two components, transition and transition group. We're going to be looking at these two components together since they do kind of similar things. These two components help with transitions and animations that are in response to changes of state. So the way they work is they wrap all of the elements inside of them, and then they append on 6 classes that are going to help with the transitions. We have enter from, which is when the element or component is entering the browser. Enter to is the end of the entering transition, and interactive is the class that's added on throughout that entering transition. Once the entering transition is complete, our component is going to rest at the natural place on the page where it's going to live, so wherever it would have naturally been set without these transitions. And it's going to stay there until something triggers the leaving transition. Then we're going to have the leave from class added on, and then the leave to is going to be added as the component transitions off of the page, and leave active is going to be added on throughout that leaving transition. So that's a lot to take in. Let's look at a code example of these components working to make a page a little more exciting with transitions. So here in my transition demo, I'm going to have a component, which is just a basic card with some cat information on it that's going to conditionally show based on this Boolean that's being toggled by the button above to add or remove the cat from the page. So let's go into the browser. We're going to remove the cat, add the cat, remove the cat. It's pretty boring. So let's go in and add the transition component to bring a little bit of life to our page. So the way this is going to work is we are going to wrap our cat card in the transition component. Let's grab that closing tag. Clean this up just a little bit, and then we will go down to the bottom where we could see those classes that we were talking about earlier. So our enter from is going to make our cat card come in to the browser on the x-axis, sliding in from the left with an opacity of 0, then resting at its natural state with 100% opacity. And then when it leaves the browser, it's going to end on the x-axis, sliding out to the right with an opacity of 0. Here are our enter and our interactive and our leave active classes below. These are going to be the same for both the entering and the leaving transition. So we're just going to give all of our transitions a 0.3 second ease. So let's go in and we're going to go back to our page and see what it looks like now that we're using the transition component. Now let's press our add a cat button, sliding in from the left, remove the cat, He slides out from the right. Very exciting. Well, we could also add more than one transition to a page. So if you have multiple things you want to animate or transition, but we need to do a few different things. So let's copy that transition component in the cat. We'll pass in our second cat here. When you have multiple transitions, you're going to need to use the name property to distinguish between the two. So our first transition was kind of a slide, so we'll name it slide. And our second transition we're going to use is just going to be a basic fade. So we'll name that second transition fade. Let's go down here. When you're using name transitions, you're going to replace that V in the front of the class with the name of the transition. So here we're going to have slide enter from, slide leave to, slide enter active, and slide leave active. Down here, for the sake of time, I've already created our fade classes. So it's just going to come in at a 0 opacity, rest at 100, leave at 0, and then all of the transitions are going to have a half-second ease on them. So let's check it out now. Now we have two completely different cats transitioning in two completely different ways, which is pretty neat. Another powerful thing that transition and transition group come with that I want to show you all is JavaScript hooks. So let's go in and add a JavaScript hook to our first transition. We don't need that second one anymore, so we got rid of it. Now, when I put in my @ you can see my autocomplete is giving me a full list of all my JavaScript hooks. They're pretty semantically named, so that's really helpful when picking the one that we need. Let's use the leave hook. And then we're going to call this function that I've created down here that just lets the cat console out a message that says, see you later. So now we're calling that leave function. Let's go back into the application. We're going to open up our inspector so we could see the cat's message. Let's clear these things out. Now he comes in, nothing happens, and as he's leaving, there's our message. So that was just a really brief overview of transition. Let's go in and look at our transition group. So for transition group, we have a list of cat cards. So there's an array of them, and we're doing a v4 on that, just passing in the cat information. And then up here, we have an input that we're going to use to filter down the cats so we could search for the one we want. Let's close up this console. We don't need it. All right, let's search for Uncle Boris. Is actually my aunt's cat growing up. Okay, so it's kind of jumpy. This could be way better if we use transitions to make these things smoothly enter and exit the page. So let's go in and we are going to wrap this group of cat cards in transition group. One of the big differences between transition and transition group is transition requires you only have one element inside, whereas transition group requires that you have multiple. Transition group also requires that you pass in a key to each element inside of it. We're passing in the key of index to keep these things separate. Now, let's go back down and check out our style block. Notice we've already named our classes, so we have to go back up, add in the name property. We've named this transition list, so let's close that up. So they're going to enter in from the x-axis 30 pixels, the opacity is 0, and on the y-axis. And now notice we have one extra class here called vMove or list move. This is going to help shuffle all of the cats around as one gets inserted or removed from the list. So we're just going to give those all a half-second ease. Now let's go in and do a search on here. You can see it looks a little better. Everything's like moving around kind of smoothly. There was so much stuff out there with transition and transition group. I saw some really cool demos and amazing way people have been using these components. We only just touched on these two components. We didn't even get into animations. So I highly encourage everybody to go out there, look at demos, play with these things. They're so much fun. But remember, if you're going really crazy with your animations or transitions, we do have some users that are sensitive to motion. So make sure you also look into using the prefers reduce motion media query when you're playing with these things. which brings us to our next component. The next one is KeepAlive. KeepAlive is going to let us conditionally cache component instances when they're dynamically rendered in a Vue. A really good place to use KeepAlive, and where I used KeepAlive, is in a tabs component. So my tabs component in the project I was working on was running into a few problems that KeepAlive was able to fix. So the first problem I was running into is I would have like search bars or form elements, and when you would tab away from that tab and tab back, the form or the search bar would get cleared out. The next problem I was running into was I had some tabs that had components inside of them that would make network calls when they were rendered. So I would click on them, they would make the network call, I'd click away and click back, and they make the network call all over again. This is happening because the content inside of my tabs was being dynamically rendered. Or conditionally rendered. So when I would tab away and tab back, they would be re-rendered all over again, sending my components back through their lifecycle phases. So if they had something that would clear out a form or make a network call, they would do that all over again. This isn't a really great user experience, so let's look at how using KeepAlive along with Vue's dynamic component can help us improve our user experiences by caching some of our tabs. So here is our next code demo. Here we have a group of 3 buttons, one for each of the components that I'm importing below. And we're using Vue's dynamic component to render each one right here. Vue's dynamic component works by passing the name of the component into this is property, and then it'll dynamically render it right there based on what you're passing it. It's pretty neat if you've never used it before. I recommend checking it out. So let's go in. Here's our tabs component. We've got our form for our cat. We're going to name him Mittens. Then we're going to go to section 1, get a list of cats, made the network call. Section 2, another network call. Back to section 1, it made the network call again. Our form has been cleared out. This isn't horrible, but it's not a really great user experience because I'm making all these calls, retyping in my form. Let's use KeepAlive to make this better. So to use KeepAlive, we're just going to wrap the dynamic component inside of KeepAlive. Let's grab that closing tag, put it down there. Now let's check out our tabs. Let's put in Mitten's name again. Go to section 1, network call. Section 2, network call. That's expected, but now everything should be cached. So our form's still filled out, no new network calls. And this is great, but caching too many things can also slow down our application. So KeepAlive comes with a few fancy props to help us manage how many things we are caching. So let's take a look at them. One of them is max. So we could set a max amount of components that we want to cache. Once it hits its maximum, it will remove the least or the last accessed component. Include, you could specifically include certain components, and exclude, you could choose to exclude specific components from your cache. So let's demo that one. We will take section 1, paste that in there, and then go back into our application. Now we're expecting everything to get cached except for section 1. So our form, Mittens again, section 1, we got a network call. Section 2, another network call. Let's go back to our form, still filled out. Network call is expected. No network call is expected. So this is really cool. That was KeepAlive. So it allows you to conditionally cache different tabs, which is pretty neat. Now let's go into our final component, which is Suspense. Suspense, it's worth mentioning again, this is still just an experimental feature, so we're not going to jump in as deep with a code example. But what it does is it helps us manage a component tree that has multiple nested components inside of it that needs to load. This solves a problem that you've probably seen before. I know I've ran into this or probably coded this before. It's when you have a component that is finished loading on the page, but then there's multiple things inside of it that are still dynamically loading. So like you'll see the full page and then a loader, another loader, and then they're all resolving at different paces. It looks a little sloppy. So this is an example of my page without suspense in it. reloaded it. You can see we've got multiple loaders going on. Doesn't look super clean. Then when we use Suspense, it helps us manage all of our different components that are loading inside of that component tree, so you only see the top layer loader. This is an example of what my page looks like when I'm using Suspense. Refresh, and I threw a skeleton loader in there too because it was pretty. Everything resolves at the exact same time. It looks great. Like I said before, we're not going to jump into a code example for this one because of time and it's still experimental. But if you do want to learn a little bit more about Suspense, I do have a full demo inside of my repo with the code that we've been going over in these videos. I will link to that. I also have a link to the blog post from Vue School that I used to learn about Suspense. Ironically, the person who wrote that is the next speaker, so check him out. There we going again. So that was my presentation on Vue's built-in components. I wanted to give a few thank yous. One to Vue School for hosting and having me. Thank you to the maintainers and builders of the tools that I used for this demo. That is Vue, Vite, and the cat API. Thank you for all those fun cat photos. Then I have links to 2 of my learning resources, that Vue School blog post I mentioned before for Suspense, and also a this.labs blog post that I used to learn a little bit more about Teleport. Thank you for attending. My name is Paige Kelley. Here is a link to my demo code, and you could follow me on Twitter at WebPageC. I will be tweeting out the links to all of these things if you're following me. So that was my presentation.
See, y'all, I joined for like a second and she wasn't done yet. See, this is like the fear is like, don't join until they're done, or just awkwardly make them wait, one or the other. Before I go into all of your questions, did I hear that your company's in Denver, or you in Denver?
Me and my company are in Denver. You're in Denver too, right?
Yeah.
I know. That's exciting. Okay. We got to meet up one day.
Yes. All right. Sorry, y'all. I had to get that out of the way. I got really excited. And thank you for everyone who also shared how many tabs they have open and some resources. We decided to go into share tabs. I think the most was like a few hundred across all of them.
Oh my God.
But yeah, how many tabs do you have open, Paige? Like, I feel like you need to be a part of that too.
I don't like having too many tabs open. Plus, I knew I was about to share my screen, so I didn't want to have anything weird open. So I just closed them all out before I started doing that. Okay. I usually average like 4 or 5. I'm not a tab hoarder. I know some people.
Oh geez. Oh geez. All right. Well, I think I have, and this is just right now, I have 3 windows with like 7 tabs each. At the moment. Normally, if I'm not streaming, there's a lot more because everybody keeps talking about Arc versus like Chrome. That's a whole nother conversation. Because I think the poll is closing soon and I'm just like purely curious, Windows, Mac, or other?
Well, I think we all saw, since I was sharing my entire screen, I'm on Mac.
You know, I still got to ask for the record.
For the record, it's a Mac.
All right.
I do have a Windows computer right behind my Mac laptop, though, so kind of 50-50.
I like it. I like it. All right. So have you ever noticed any exciting real-world implementation of Vue.js built-in components?
I haven't gone in and like really dug through anyone else's code, but I know like in my actual projects, I have some real-world implementation of them. And one of the most exciting things, like I thought, was like refactoring some of my stuff with these built-in components. So like I mentioned earlier, I'm working on a component library, and there's some like these built-in components are so useful. Like if you're building a component library, they're like weirdly perfect pre-built solutions for some things. Like the amount of code it took me to build a tabs component before I found out about KeepAlive and the dynamic component was ridiculous. Using those 2 things, it's like 30 lines of code. Also, like the transitions and transition groups, when you're creating something like a dialogue or a modal that needs to like pop out of nowhere and you want it to fade in nicely and fade out nicely. Without those things, I could go in circles explaining the workarounds you have to do. Like these components solve for so many weird workarounds that you'd normally have to do if they weren't available. So I guess that would be the real world implications that I think are exciting.
I like it. All right. What do you think about using Suspense since it's still considered experimental?
I don't know. I really like it. Like, I hope it moves out of its experimental phase because, like, that's a real problem we run into, having nested things. There are workarounds, like, you could wrap things in ifs, but it's a lot slower, a lot sloppier. Using Suspense in my demo, just like, I never knew I needed it till I started playing with it, and now I'm like, I don't wanna go back. So I might give it a try here or there. Like, if I run into a place where I'm like, "Oh, this'll solve a problem," and I have too many loaders, I'll probably slap some suspense in there. Hope nobody notices it's experimental. I'm just praying it's approved.
All right, I dig it. Do you know of any resources that provide inspiration or snippets of various Vue.js transitions for use with the transition component?
Okay, so some inspiration for those transitions. I dug a lot into this. So I started off by just like going to the Vue documentation, and they have some really good like basic examples of snippets for this transition or the transition components. And then I started Googling it, and it was just I was clicking the things that would come up, and a lot of good things were in there. One of the examples, and I wish I could remember exactly where I found it, somebody was using a like random shuffle. I can't even describe it. I think it was on like a Spotify blog post or something. Just dig in there. There is some cool stuff people have made with these components.
Yes. And in addition to all the built-in components available, are there any new things that you would like to see transformed into components?
This is a hard one. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I know as soon as we get off of this call, I'm gonna be like, "Oh, I should have said this one thing."
It's okay.
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I guess I'm just satisfied with what we have right now, but I know as soon as we get off, I'm gonna be like, "I should have said that."
So we all need to follow Paige on Twitter. So that way we keep up to date with what you like popped into your head right afterwards, because that happens to me too. And I know we talked a lot about all the cats, and I feel like my dog heard us because she just decided to like come join me. And I was like, hi. So if you see me like awkwardly kind of like going down, it's definitely my dog. But thank you, Paige, so much for coming on and sharing with us. I'm so glad we were able to get your presentation working, and looking forward to hearing more from you later on.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for helping me work through those technical difficulties too. Thank you, everyone.
Definitely.